you all for coming today for this special screening and panel. I'm David Blight. I'm the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. I'm going to let Connie Royster explain how we got connected with Connie, and therefore this film and this event. But I want to thank my staff first, who do all the work to get you invited and get you checked in. It's Michelle Zaks, my associate director, who's up here. Melissa McGrath, Tamara Michelle, who's walking down the aisle, and Daisha Bradlin, who will outside checking you all in. They run our education program. And Tom Thurston, who's been sitting here doing his email actually. He's working on our newsletter as we speak right there in front. Okay, anyway, thank you. The Gilder Lehrman Center does all sorts of events related to slavery and abolition and the many legacies of those processes. And we particularly are devoted to taking this broad story beyond Yale's gates, beyond our borders, outside of this place. We're happy to do events inside of Yale for all of Yale's wonderful students and esteemed faculty, but we are especially keen to reach the many publics, and that's especially important just now. You probably don't need me to tell you. History itself is something we have to defend now in ways most of us probably didn't think we'd ever quite have to again, but we do. There is a highly developed and well paid for effort to stymie, if not destroy, so much of the history that's been written, rewritten, conceived, reconceived over the past half century, 75 years, certainly my whole lifetime. So today's subject is deeply important in that sense. We're going to start the film immediately, although I do have to thank some co-sponsors who paid for all this. The Afro-American Cultural Center at Yale, the Beinecke Library, the Black Studies Department, Dwight Hall at Yale, the Film and Media Studies Program, and the Whitney Humanities Center, and the Yale Divinity School. Thank you, Willie. It's about a 20-minute film. It's been to many film festivals, but it's not yet publicly available for streaming, so you have a special opportunity today. This is a film by Susanna Styron, who has for years taught film at many different universities, and she's a Yale graduate. And we're honored to have her here. So without further ado, My Father's Name by Susanna Styron. Thank you.
Deep breath. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Connie Royster, and it was my honor to executive produce this film. I have a few brief comments and introductions of the panelists, and then we'll get on to the panel discussion and audience Q&A. I'm in the Yale College class of 1972 and a huge champion of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale. David Blight and Michelle Zaks embraced the screening of this film back in the spring when we discussed it during the official opening events at the President's Room in Woolsey Hall for the Yale and Slavery exhibition. If you haven't seen that, you need to forthwith. We thank David and Michelle for this opportunity. I also want to thank the other organizations at Yale and the Yale departments for their support of this event. Okay, so how did I come to this project? In 2021, I was on my own history journey in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and traveling some of my Aunt Constance Baker Motley's civil rights legacy. There was a window in the pandemic lockdown, and I was headed to Montgomery, Alabama, and the Equal Justice Initiative's legacy memorials. Susanna Styron, the director of this film, joined me on that trip to do research on this film. At the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the suspended steel beams contain the names of Roosevelt Towns and Robert McDaniels. I knew this film had to be made, and I knew I couldn't let my dear white friend of more than 50 years go it alone. I've been back to that sacred ground in Montgomery and to many other sacred places of history, struggle, and violence, including Duck Hill, Mississippi. My participation in this film was a privilege and a responsibility. This narrative short documentary gives voice to Jan's story and that of these two lynched men. It is deeply layered. There is much to unpack about an American history of secrecy and the shroud of silence, of terror and violence, of responsibility and accountability, of current efforts to erase truth, and so much more. I look forward to the conversation we are about to hear as much as you do. Our distinguished panel includes Director Susanna Styron, my dear friend, Professor David Blight, Professor Crystal Feimster, and Professor Willie Jennings. I will briefly introduce them. Susanna Styron is a graduate of Yale College, class of 1976. Her first documentary short, Suspended Sentence, was her senior thesis, and it is in the collection of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Since then, she has worked extensively in documentary and narrative film and television as a director and screenwriter. Her award-winning work has been seen in film festivals around the world, in theatrical release, and on such outlets as HBO, Netflix, and Amazon, among others. For nearly 30 years, Susanna taught screenwriting and directing and writing for television on the faculties of the graduate film programs at Columbia and NYU and at Princeton. David Blight is Sterling Professor of History at Yale and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. He chaired the Yale and Slavery Working Group, where he and his team authored the book Yale and Slavery, A History, published by Yale University Press in February 2024, which is a deep narrative study of Yale's historic involvement with slavery and its aftermaths. That book is also available and I recommend it highly. He is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, which won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. Professor Blight is first and foremost a teacher, and one of 3 distinguished Yale professors currently teaching the Devane lecture course entitled America at 250, A History. Crystal Feimster is an associate professor in the departments of African American Studies, now Black Studies, and History, and the programs of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Feimster is an historian of 19th and 20th century American history, U.S. women's history, and the American South. Among many other writings and forthcoming books, she is the author of the prize-winning book, Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching. In recognition of her dedication to undergraduate and graduate teaching, Professor Feimster has been the recipient of numerous awards for teaching and mentoring students. In addition, she is head of college of Pearson College. Willie Jennings is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Systemic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School. Professor Jennings is a theologian who teaches in the areas of Christian thought, race theory, decolonial, and environmental studies. He is the author of The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race, published by Yale University Press, and After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging, both of which are award-winning and have become classics in theology and theological education. A scholar and lecturer on Christianity and race, Professor Jennings is internationally recognized as a major thought leader in theological studies and theological education. Professor Jennings is also an ordained Baptist minister. Thank you all for being here. Please welcome the panelists. I turn the program over to Professor
Here we go. That's good. It's a great honor to host this event. And the filmmaker, Susanna, and my 2 colleagues. I just want to say at the outset, memory is a profound, awesome, and tricky and difficult thing. We're the only species, so far as we know, that actually, all mammals and animals of all kinds have memory of some kind. They have instinctive memory. They couldn't do so much of what they do. How those birds leave Canada and land on the same dimes 6,000 miles away every year, who knows how they do that. But we're the only species that knows that we have a memory, are conscious of it, knows that we can actually know our own history, and that's the problem. There are all kinds of memory. There's obviously individual biological memory. And when I first got into memory studies, I was being asked all the time, what do you mean by memory? Memory is biological. It's in the brain and it's probably up on the left side. Well, fine. And the neuroscientists have been working on that for generations. And my God, what they've been able to show us. But as soon as you get into that level of collective memory, how societies remember, how groups of people remember, that's where it gets so messy, doesn't it? So interesting, so troublesome. St. Augustine called our memory the treasury in our minds. Treasury. But then he went on to explain why it's so problematic, so difficult. Every philosopher worth salt has written about memory. There would be no literature without memory. There would be no brilliant filmmaking without memory. We are creatures of memory. We don't have a choice. One other quick thing, and then I want to get to the panel's first reaction to the film, although I won't ask Susanna to critique her own film. I will ask her to explain how this came about. But right up the street here in the James Weldon Johnson papers, where I've spent way too many hours in the past couple of years, I'm doing a new biography of James Weldon Johnson, and his papers are voluminous. He led the anti-lynching campaign of the NAACP. And there's a document, I mean, there are many documents, but there's an incredible document there. It's a 1917 petition, one page, that he, as field secretary of the NAACP, and a group of about 16 New York or northern-based black leaders prepared. It was a very heady moment for them because they had just organized the famous Silent March. 10,000 African Americans down Fifth Avenue, led by drums, Johnson and Du Bois out front, women in white dresses, as far as the eye could see up Fifth Avenue, silent. And there were causes of that, the East St. Louis riot, two particularly horrific lynchings that had just occurred. And I want to come back to that because the way the press, as this film shows, covered lynchings is just a profound part of the story. They could not stop covering lynchings. But that petition, they prepared and they were ready and they were quite excited. They took the train, 11 of them took the train down to Washington. They thought they had an appointment at the White House and they were going to deliver this petition to President Woodrow Wilson to begin to get, they hoped, presidential authority behind the anti-lynching bill. The idea had been around for quite a while, but this was the launch of the NAACP's almost endless attempts for such a bill. They took it to the White House, and President Wilson's secretary, J.P. Tumulty, said, "President's too busy." He never met with him. Now, Johnson will go back and spend almost a year and a half of his life in Washington, lobbying in the 20, 21, parts of 22, for that bill, which will pass the House, but not the Senate, as the film shows us. But the president was too busy. Americans have been, well, not just too busy to deal with lynching, but too preoccupied with trying to imagine themselves in a history that pleases them, that they want to live in, a narrative that makes them proud, a narrative that is ultimately about progress. Where do you fit lynching in that narrative? In part, you can't, but in part, you can, which I think is the case with all really difficult histories. But you first have to be ready to look at it and face it. Susanna, if you don't mind going first, how did this film happen? How did you come to this particular story? Why the story of Jan Frazier?
So I did not set out to make this film or to make a film about this subject. I had been trying to make a documentary that I ultimately had to abandon for reasons that don't matter in this conversation, but about a woman named Roxy Bolton who had been a trailblazing feminist in Florida and also a civil rights champion. And when she died, there was an obituary in the New York Times, a significant obituary, and one of the things it mentioned was the fact that she was born, that she came from Duck Hill, Mississippi, and that at the age of 10 she had witnessed a lynching, and that was one of the things that probably contributed to her activism. I tried to go down that road in the interviews I did, and nobody who she ever talked to, she had died already, but nobody she talked to had ever heard anything about it, so I didn't really get anywhere on that path. During the pandemic, I got an email out of the blue from Jan Frazier saying, I got your number, your email address from David Bolton, who is Roxy's son. And Jan had been researching, as she says, after the murder of George Floyd, she started doing more research again, and it all came back up for her. And she came across Roxy's obituary, and she saw Duck Hill, and she contacted David, and David said, I don't know anything about it, but ask Susanna Styron. She was making a film about my mother. So I got this email, and I wrote her back, and I said, unfortunately, I can't give you any more information about the lynching, but your story is so incredible. Can we talk? So what grabbed me, I've rarely thought, oh, I want to make a film about this particular subject. It's usually something comes along and just gets a hold of me, and that was the case with this. But what got a hold of me, I will admit, was not the lynching itself or what it had to say about race in America or our legacy, but the very emotional part of what do you do when you find out something so horrible about somebody you love so much? So that was what drew me into it, and I couldn't get over that. It was such a kind of a crystallized example of that dilemma that I think can be very universal. And of course, then it could not exist outside the context of the story of the lynching. So it began to, be a story that was existing on both of those levels. And then when we talked some more, and I learned about the photographs and the significance of this particular lynching, and I realized there was all this archival material, and the story was even bigger than I thought. Then I realized I had a film.
You do indeed have a film.
And it's tight, and it's compelling, and it's aesthetically powerful. We can come back to that. Crystal and Willie, I wonder if you'd offer first, before we dig in and do some history, your own reactions. Because we all saw the film ahead of time. Susanna was kind enough to send it to us. It's not available on streaming yet, but we all got to see it. So, Crystal, you go first?
First, let me just say thank you to Connie and Susan for your work on this film. Also to David and Michelle for inviting me to be part of the conversation along with Connie. It's been a long time since I've talked about this subject of lynching. I think speaking with you all on Zoom really brought back a lot of this time and place that I lived in for almost 2 decades, writing 7 horrors. So I found the film particularly compelling around a kind of longer history of the ways in which white women come in and out of the narrative of mob violence and where Jane fits into that history. And particularly, I kept thinking as David was talking, we didn't talk about this in our conversation. We talked a little bit about memory, but I kept thinking memory is a tricky thing, right? I don't play with it that much, to be honest, because it's really tricky.
But you started losing it.
When you're writing and thinking about lynching, the question is always who is allowed to forget and who doesn't forget, right? And then if you go to that exhibit, right, in Alabama, it's clear that Black people have not forgotten this history, that we remember it, that white people, as Jane says, are allowed to not talk about it, to not remember it, to not name it. And when I say not name it, I mean literally not name it at the hands of people unknown, right? And so there is a long history of particularly Southern white women trying to name and remember this history, from Jessie Daniel Ames, who founded the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching in the 1930s, late after Ida B. Wells' death, who had done that work from the 1880s. You have Lillian Smith, who wrote Killers of the Dream, which I think is a powerful book for white people to read, particularly because she reminds us that these horrors, or what I call, and Ida Wells calls Southern horrors, aren't just about Black people suffering. It's about the psychological damage that this kind of violent white supremacy does to white people. And particularly she focuses on what it does to white women. And the phrase killer of the dream kind of fits into that soul murder. And I think Jane is a part of that longer tradition and history. Reckoning is what I would call it, with her family history of white violence. And I'll just leave it there. So in that front, I found the film particularly powerful and emotional because for the work that it does for white people and requires of white people after they see this.
I'm very thankful to be a part of this panel, and thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for that fabulous film. When I watched it, reminded me of my many years teaching at another institution before Yale. There was like before Yale.
And after, we hope.
in the deep south of North Carolina. And I had many students who had similar stories. And then you mentioned memory, and for many of those students, they did not want to touch memory. Because to know what their parents and grandparents knew brought them into that memory. They did not want to remember inside of their remembering. And I would always marvel at the students who would come to my office and quietly confess to me what they knew. I remember one particular student who talked about how he and his brother wanted to confront their father about what their grandfather had done. Their grandfather not only had participated in a lynching, but facilitated it, and was also a part of the celebratory aspect of it, which is something that was hinted at in the film, but not really talked about. It was not simply a matter of justice, it was also a matter of celebration. That an order of life, the order of being was being reestablished powerfully with lynching. And so my students, they struggled with that, what it means to touch memory, because to touch memory would also bridge something that they did not want to get bridged to, something else they didn't want to touch, and that was guilt. Guilt is such a powerful thing in America, and we have learned so well how to avoid the very idea of guilt. And that was one of the things my students struggled so much with, because especially in a theological context where we understand that guilt is a very important reality to face, because in facing guilt, you also face yourself. And what was underneath that reality of guilt was something my students struggled to touch, their whiteness. And inside that whiteness, the thing that scared them the most was the reality that this lynching is not so far from their very identity. That to kill a black body and to be able to continue to move forward in life, even with that death, was a possibility for them. And that's what they struggled with. And so, thank you. This film reminded me of that fabric that continues to be so important. You can feel it often better in the South, but it is a fabric that covers the entire country.
Indeed. I'd like all of us here to dive in, do a little history of that. I think we owe our audience some degree of, I want to come back to the spiritual, emotional power of this film, because that's, I think, the level on which we all see it. A parent, a father, a mother, but this came out of somewhere in the late 19th century. It came out of sources and roots and so on. A very quick anecdote here. Sure, many of you know, or if you don't. An exhibition of lynching photographs, the postcard collection, it was mostly postcards, of a collector named James Allen and his partner, John Littlefield. In about 1998 or 99, they did an exhibition in a very small art gallery on the east side of Manhattan. But suddenly the audiences were so large that they couldn't house the people. No, there'd never been an exhibition like this. This was a collection of just dozens and dozens and dozens of lynching photographs. The most horrible things you can ever look at in a photo. And so many of them were postcards that people sent each other with inscriptions on the back. So they moved it over to the New York Historical Society, which had a much bigger space. And the New York Historical Society had the largest audience for an exhibition they had ever had. In part, I think, because it was so profoundly new to people. Black and white, of all kinds of backgrounds. And I was there shortly after it opened on a weekend. And they had a back room. You could go through the exhibition, but then they had a back room with some computer terminals and some staff willing to talk with people. And I actually attended one of these that they turned into a kind of a group conversation. And it was just stunning. All sorts of people saying, why don't I know this? Why have I never seen this? Why? Well, okay, we're kind of still asking that, but this came from somewhere. And I don't want to get too clinical here. But what do we know, Crystal, Willie, Susanna, about why this came about when it did? Now, lynching, things like lynchings, mobs killing people, are ancient. But something particular happened in America, given the racial situation in the South, really during Reconstruction, but especially during the 1880s, that led to this. About 149 lynchings per year in the 1890s. And according to the Tuskegee collection, between 1880 and 1950, almost 4,000 lynchings. Then if you go all the way to 1968, you get different statistics. Statistics can become nothing but clinical, but they are remarkable. Almost none of them prosecuted in court. To the average American who first sees this, how could this happen, and why did it happen in that roughly 40-year period? Crystal, want to start on that? Why then?
We know there's a long history of racial violence, racial and sexual violence in this country. So under slavery, Black people were forced to labor for free, and that was sustained by violence, right? This nation is founded on forced labor, and that forced labor required the whip and chains, right? And so when you have emancipation, how do you keep people in place? How do you force them to labor for low wages? Right? How do you keep them from advocating for their civil, economic, and political rights? You terrorize them. So mob violence, the KKK undermined radical Reconstruction. The federal government pulled out of the South. That mob violence became the law of the land, right? And there were myths and narratives and lies perpetuated to justify that kind of violence. The most common narrative is the rape lynch narrative that argued that white men lynched in the South to keep black men from raping white women. That was the narrative, and it functioned to keep black people quiet. It functioned to keep white people quiet. It functioned to keep white women quiet, because it wasn't just about policing black men's sexuality. It was about policing white women's sexuality as well, right? But it also became justification for denying black people their economic and political rights. If you could argue that black people were uncivilized, that they raped and murdered, then you could justify not giving them their economic and political rights. So we have the rise of Jim Crow, right? So when James' brother says justice was served, in a country that has a legal system that argues innocent until proven guilty, how can you speak about justice when you have a mob that tortures and brutalizes people before they have been tried by a jury of their peers, which is not possible for black people under Jim Crow America, right? So even thinking about justice is something that is reserved for white people, not black people, right? This is the moment, right? So Ida B. Wells in the 1880s makes the argument that it is about economics, right? In the 1890s, we have economic, I could give a lecture. I read the book. Like, I'm giving you one thread, but the economics is a part of it, right? So we have an economic crash in the 1890s, right?
Michelle has a clock on.
Yeah, so what happens when black people start pushing back, right? So that you do have, you know, a kind of black political movement that's happening. You know about the civil rights movement of the 60s, but it's happening in the 80s and 90s. You have interracial fusions in places like Virginia. You got the readjusters, right? People who are trying to create class and racial alliances in the 1890s. What we might think about is that populist movement, the agrarian revolt, right? And that has to be stamped down, right? You have women who are moving into the political sphere, white women demanding the right to vote and the franchise. And how do you keep them at home and afraid and dependent on white male power, political, economic, and the discourse of protection? You say you go out in the streets and black men gonna rape you. Keep your butt at home, right? So there are all of these arguments that are happening simultaneously. And the reason you have white women the first to kind of speak up because they understand that it is a threat. The threat of lynching black men is a threat to them. If you do not stay in your place, if you do not abide by these sexual rules, you are the ones responsible for white purity. You are the ones responsible for keeping the race white. Now, that's white men. We gonna do what we gonna do, right? And we're gonna have and engage in interracial sexual violence. But you can't do that. And if you do, you will be punished, and the black men who engage in consensual sex will be punished. So there are all of these narratives that kind of collide in this particular moment in the 1890s that gets taken to task. And white women sort of come into those debates in the 1930s when they find the Association of white women for the prevention of lynching when they push back against those sexual narratives. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, that's good. I just want to add, in case you didn't get the point. I mean, when you observe photos and so on, lynchings, it comes across first, again, if one doesn't know any of this history, it just looks like madness and savagery. But it's actually politics. It's a political economic act in most instances. You think you want to vote? Oh, right. Oh, right. But anyway, Willie, go ahead, pick that up.
There's nothing to pick up. That was wonderful. The one thing I want to build on what was so brilliantly said by Crystal is the reality of racial threat that is felt and then operationalized in all these actions. And it's that reality of racial threat that reaches us to this very moment. The sense that there is an emerging population that will take from us what is ours. And that, to me, that's the crucial thing that I think so many people refuse to see, that deep point of connection. How a reality of racial threat can be reborn again and again and again. I'm so glad you mentioned Killers of the Dream. I used to have my students also read that. And what I want students to see, similar to what you want students to see, is that the book points to a formation of men and especially women. And Lillian, in that book, she's mourning her own formation as a white woman. And the reason I want students to read that is because I wanted them to see an occasion for mourning before you worry about the guilt. What do I want you to mourn? I want you to mourn that you've been formed inside whiteness. And there's a certain reality that if you understand that, the question is not whether you feel guilty or not. The question is, do you realize that you have been formed on the other side of that guilt?
I mean, Willie was thinking, the same thing you said of slavery. I've often said it's not always easy to convey, but slavery has to be mourned too, before you can begin to deal with these questions of responsibility and guilt and national responsibility, whatever. It needs a mourning, and there's a culture of mourning. That's what culture's for. Susanna, this is a book about a woman and her father, and her uncle, her whole family. And her brother. It's her lineage of a kind. How did you come, to this and out of this? I'm not asking you for your own background at all here, but how did you come out of this thinking about the sins of the fathers? And how, there are probably one or two people here who've had a problematic relative. Anybody have a problematic relative? Uncle so-and-so, whatever. Okay. No one's going to raise their hand too much on that. Wait till Thanksgiving. Sorry, but what about the sins of the? This is an ancient question. It's an ancient question in literature, in philosophy. What do we do with the sins of the fathers? How do you come away from this thinking about that?
I'm not sure I can answer that in a very direct way. I can,
It's okay.
or in as kind of global a way as that. For me, it was a very personal experience. And, speaking of the sins of the father, I'm descended from slave owners. My father told me when I was growing up about his grandmother telling him about her slaves. She was given 2 little girls as a birthday present when she was a child. And that was like, I can't even make sense of that as reality, but I know that as a family story. But what I became very interested in, speaking of guilt, was how do, as white people, how do we participate in some kind of, not solution, there's no solution to this, but how do we participate in some kind of healing or reconciliation or some kind of process without making it about ourselves? Because what I came across, what I felt around myself and in conversation with Jan, but also in conversation with Connie and I had a black editor and I had black colleagues and friends who I worked with and showed the film to. It was very obviously, that was very important to continue, to get that perspective, was that guilt is a morass. I mean, it's like, but what do you do with it? Guilt can be productive if you can do something with it. And it's got to be more than an apology, because an apology asks forgiveness from and makes the other person do the work. It's like white people have to stop asking black people to tell them how to do this. And I mean, this is all stuff I sort of learned along the way. I didn't think about this before I started making this film. And it was very important to me. She wrote the letter, she published the letter before I ever met her. And she did, it's longer than what I put in there. Because, it's too long to put the whole thing in. But also I was selective about, she does apologize. She does say I'm sorry. Maybe she says I'm sorry once in there. But what I realized was important to do was to shift the action of this from apology to accountability. And that I really wanted to emphasize that aspect of what she was trying to do, was to hold her family accountable, not ask for somebody to make her feel better about it. And that was important to her, too. Did that agree with it?
I appreciate you saying that. That was beautifully stated. Theologically, in terms of religious studies, religious life, one of the most important things about guilt is that guilt invites us to see ourselves inside of a story. And I think that's what's so beautiful about your film. She understood her family inside a story. And one of the great problems in this country is that we deny the story we're inside of every day. And one of the deep frustrations for so many people of color is that when people who identify as white deny they're inside a story. And so guilt is not so much about how one navigates it personally. It really is about the structure of the story that you understand yourself to be inside of, that is America. And it is stepping into the fabric of that story, understanding that I don't just appear out of nothing, that I'm inside a long history, is so crucial for how one moves forward individually and collectively. You cannot deal with guilt unless you deal with the story. And so to be inside story then opens up the possibility of new ways of thinking of how I will move forward with others. I think at the end of the day, for so many people, what is inside kind of racial confession? You recognize that you are tied to me. You recognize that you're tied to a common fabric that means that you cannot escape it, because we certainly cannot escape it. But of course, we know now politically and socially in this country right now, the current administration wants more than anything else to deny that story.
Preach it, Reverend. I thought there were moments in the film, I wonder how others think here, you will tell us in Q&A, where Jan is beginning to speak for all. she's beginning to, if it's, whether it's just white people or it's America or it's just a collective humanity, she's beginning to think, I mean, good Lord, she writes these letters to nobody, as far as she knows, but she's beginning to speak for a lot. You captured that, or she, I mean, you sat with her long enough, so you captured that. She is speaking for more than just herself. And she's not just wringing her hands, oh my God, me and my family. And that's perhaps why this works, in part. Go ahead, Susanna.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the power of one person's story representing something bigger than herself, something universal. It's actually why I kept it just to her. I mean, this story could have been told a lot of ways. It could have been expanded out. It could have been, much.
Could have had talking heads, historians, and that would ruin the film. It would have been 45 minutes.
Exactly. But yeah, and also that's part of the filmmaking process too, is to find to contain it that way. I mean, there are plenty of. She did plenty of crying, for instance. It's very emotional for her. She cried on camera many times, and I looked at the footage and I was like, no crying.
I noticed that. I kept waiting for her to break down. But
She did, but I didn't want that in the film. I had the editing table. Because I didn't want to impose that emotion on the audience. I think it's there. You find it if the story is told. And she had, she got emotional, but she also has this wonderfully kind of connected but dispassionate way of talking and telling the story, which I think is very effective. And now I can't remember if you had a question.
But you caught her saying, or not caught, you captured her saying, I couldn't sort it out, which is what you also said in a sense. And then there's a moment where she says, you can't reconcile it. And, Americans always want redemption. I mean, I don't want to step into your territory too much. But Americans just want stories to end in redemption. Well, they want things to get reconciled.
Yeah.
They don't even like movies anymore that, might not have an exit for you, or they won't get made. You know what I mean? But she knows she can't reconcile it. And that's a human achievement to realize that there are tragedies we should forget trying to reconcile and find other ways to act about it. You captured her saying that. I thought that was terrific.
Thank you.
Or terrific on her part too. She was so open and so brave and so strong, and she was, there was a point. I did 2 interviews with her. I did some on Zoom. I recorded some on Zoom during the pandemic just to put some things together to raise some money. But then I went, for the first time I was able to go and interview her in person. And I got all the story, this happened, this happened, this happened. And we started to get comfortable with each other. And she told a lot of the story. Including the fact that 2 black men had murdered, the background was the 2 black men had murdered this white member of their family. And we were getting comfortable with each other, and I had this long interview, and then we were done, and she had the materials, she had the newspapers from the, the copies of the local papers from when it happened. She gave me copies to take home, so I got home, and I'm looking at the footage, and I'm looking through all the papers, and I went, wait a minute, there were no witnesses. Why did she say 2 black men did this? And she had also talked about how her uncle, he was a lovely man, and he was a product of his time and his place, and
like, I wasn't really okay with that when I sat with it and was looking at the footage. And I said to her, I want to come back and I want to interview you again, if it's okay with you. And I want you to throw away all your notes. I don't want you to tell me, I don't want you to forget the facts, forget what happened. I want to go to a deeper emotional level, and I have some hard questions for you, and are you up for that? And she said, bring it on. And I went back, and I said to her, I pointed out that there were no witnesses, and that she had read that story herself many times, and she went, oh my God, she had drunk her, even with all this consciousness she was having herself with this story and written letter, she had drunk her uncle's Kool-Aid and hadn't gotten, she hadn't noticed that. So that's then, she said in the interview, for the longest time, I didn't even wonder who had done it. So it took that to another level. And then I said, I can't remember how I phrased it, because as a documentary filmmaker, you really don't want to put words in people's mouth, but I wanted her to get to that she was letting her family off the hook. So, I kind of went there and poked her about, really? It was like, you really think that? And she went, I was letting them off the hook. She got there. So, and that's very hard to do. It's like being naked, and she was willing to do that, and I and I so admire that. And this film, they couldn't be the film it is without her ability to be so honest.
And that's not always common when it comes to family memory. Right? It's not an easy thing for anybody to do. Can we hear you talk just a bit about the aesthetics of this film? That is, your method here, your graphics. This is not all brand new, but it's a new thing in documentary film. It's probably much older than I realized. But I thought that worked. You didn't overdo it, but
well,
how do you make those kinds of decisions?
Yeah. So I had the film I made before this was a feature documentary where I used animation for the first time to illustrate. People talk and talk, and you don't want to just have talking heads. And some things you can't illustrate with, or you don't want to illustrate with still photographs or some kind of archival stuff. It just, you want to bring it to life a little more. My previous film, it was drawn animation. It was very beautiful drawn animation for part of the story. When I got to this, and the person who had done the titles for that other film had not done the drawn animation, but is a graphic designer who had done titles and things like, information that pops out of a piece of paper or, twirls around, that kind of thing. Was a brilliant graphic designer named Todd Ruff, who was Yale class of 75, and we met here, and we have been friends ever since. And we never worked together until the previous film, because I wasn't using that kind of stuff that he does. So I got him involved with this when I was talking about animation. Again, I knew there were parts of the story that had to be animated, and I was thinking drawn animation. And I was talking to Todd about animators because he was doing the graphics, all that newspaper stuff. And he said, I have some ideas. It was basically the story of the crime, the shooting of the store owner, and then the To Kill a Mockingbird scene, the going to the movies with her father. Those were the two parts of the story that I knew really needed to be told in animation. And so Todd just came up with these the thing with the store and the cash register and the blood and the arm on the floor, and then he came up, we knew it was a drive-in, and he came up with that whole thing. I knew I was using footage from To Kill a
Your
Mockingbird.
dad at the drive-in is pretty compelling.
Yeah, I know. Amazing. That's Todd. That's all Todd.
Do you remember drive-ins? Yeah.
So animation is a wonderful tool for filmmakers now, for documentary filmmakers, because there's so many things you can do now, and it just can bring things to life.
Yeah. Now, Crystal and Willie and I would love to keep giving you lectures on the socioeconomic and spiritual and philosophical roots of all that white supremacy in the late 19th century. However, it's time for Q&A. So, do we have a mic floating around on both sides? So you want to take one of them? Okay. We may need to share our mics.
I'm a former teacher, so I can shout.
Well, but we're recording it, so yeah, I know. Teachers have their teacher voice. Right?
You got it.
Yeah, but you want to go first?
Yes.
Okay.
Quick question.
I think you just volunteered to go first.
This is for Susanna. Thank you all, by the way, for your presentation. It's terrific. I'm wondering if Jan had ever changed her perspective on her mother. Did she share anything with you about how her mother might have been a co-conspirator or in any way changed?
Her mother did not know her father when the lynching took place. They met later when he was in the Navy. Her mother,
But she's from Duck Hill, right?
No. Her father's from Duck Hill. Her mother's from Miami.
Oh.
And then she grew up in Miami. His ship came into Miami. They met, and then they got married. And so Jan grew up in Miami. Her mother was crazy. Her mother was really, it was dark. I left the part about her, I put the part about her mother in, even though it's not about her mother, to give a sense of how the way in which she took refuge in her father.
Yeah.
And how much she needed him for emotional kind of protection. Her mother outlived her father. Her mother was, and she said this on film, I just left it out because it just wasn't how I was telling the story. Her mother was openly racist. And her mother was also very fragile. So when her mother was still alive when she and her brother found out about the lynching, and they never brought it up with her because they were certain she didn't know, and they didn't want to deal with what would happen if she found out. It was like she couldn't handle this, and they didn't want to do that.
Thanks for sharing that.
Who's next? Oh, right there, right here. Tamara, can you slide it through this? Thanks.
Yes, I just want to say I really enjoyed the film, if that's the right word for it. I'm a professor of journalism. I teach at Southern Connecticut. I teach a class called Race and the News, and it's a course that deals with the effect that race has on the news and the effect that news has on race. I know that you had mentioned about the role of journalism with lynchings, and there's a segment of my course where we actually talk about that effect of how journalists basically would sell these stories of these events as it was almost like a carnival or a sporting event. And one of the things that I would do with my students, I have them do an assignment called Finding Race in the News. And they look from a period of time up into the 1950s or whatever, from the 1800s, and they would find a story, in this particular case, on lynchings. So, and one of the things that I would find when they would do this is because what I do is I use newspapers as my primary teaching tool. I think you get a ringside seat from history when you look at these old newspaper clippings, and it's very helpful. So I just wanted to point out that it was I love journalism. I think journalism is an important tool, but it was also used as a way to help promote lynchings and to also, I guess, profit from it, from the sale of newspapers and so on. But again, I thank you for that, for delivering this film for us, and I would actually like to be able to have access to it to use and add to my students so that they can have a look at this as well.
I will tell you how to do that at the end of this. Can we do that at the end? Okay.
Sure.
I just wanted to
Rachel, go ahead, Willie.
comment about the press, so that we don't forget the black press in this moment, and that there are, we get an anti-lynching movement from Ivy Wells, who's a black journalist, and her press gets burned to the ground because she challenges the myth and says that this threadbare lie of black men raping white women, if the white men aren't careful, people are going to start thinking negative about the white women, and her press gets burned. And so there is this dynamic between the black press sort of trying to write against that. Wonderful work by Jacqueline Dowd Hall about how the Southern white press is kind of a pornography, racial pornography, the recounting of these lynchings and how they tell them. And there's a real script that gets written and rewritten over, 80 years about lynching.
And I would just add, and I'm sure our colleague from Southern Connecticut knows this, but James Weldon Johnson was a great journalist. He wrote the editorials every week in the New York Age, the largest circulation black newspaper in the country from 1915 into 1920. And this is how, well, he was interested in lynching because he was almost lynched 3 times himself. But he monitors, especially the Southern newspapers. And he's getting all these newspapers all over the country. He's monitoring all these newspapers. Send your students to the New York Age. And somebody cut every one of his editorials out and pasted them in his papers. But he starts monitoring lynchings in the Southern press. And he's writing about lynching, I'd say, in every other issue of that newspaper. It's just, so he's writing about lynching, but about the press at the same time. He's covering how they're covering it, which is actually itself an interesting story. I think we have the next one right there. And then Michelle will go over here, same row. Go ahead. Thank you.
Peace to everyone. Thank you for the film. It brought tears to my eyes, and it really kind of disturbed my soul. My family comes from Mississippi, Clarksdale, and as well as Arkansas, Tennessee. So we're in that genre. So I think for me, as a black woman, as a black American, America has always had this cognitive dissonance around what they think that they are. All men are created equal, and then they put an asterisk. They said, except for black people, they're 3/5 of a human being. And so we're always an asterisk to whatever is supposed to be the image that people want to perpetuate. But my work has been around the healing of black people, because we have had to suppress our thoughts, feelings, emotions, that don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, since we came to these shores, because it is not safe for us to talk about any of that. So I just, from what the Reverend was talking about, to just say a little bit more about us and how we have come to be the forgiving human beings that we are, and the type of people that can, I can sit in this room with you, but I also am very conscious and cognizant of the history of this room.
Well, this is a complicated thing, isn't it? It's a complicated thing for us because so many black folks have always made these beautiful distinctions inside forgiveness. I might forgive, but I ain't forgot nothing. That's number one. Right. I ain't forgot nothing. And then even inside there is a kind of mourning, right? Because I think of my own dad who was born and raised outside of Little Rock. And he never talked about Little Rock. He was born around the same time, 1917, 1918. And in the late 20s, early 30s, there was a major lynching in Little Rock. My dad would have been a little boy, and I found out he probably heard about that lynching, never talked about it. But my eldest brothers knew about it, and so they kind of carried inside them the memory that my dad had. But they were all Christians. And so how do you carry the memory of people who've done this horrible thing, never repented for it, never apologized for it? And yet, you know for your own soul, you have to somehow touch that word forgiveness. But what does that mean? It's like playing tennis with someone who's not going to hit the ball back. But you still have your racket and the ball is still there. What exactly are you doing? And so for us, that means our memory work, as you said, is always tricky, always thick, always complicated. But we have to do it. We have to enter that memory work for our own sake. It would be nice to have friends who share in that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your film, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you all. And to Professor Feimster's point about journalism, I wanted to point you to, if I'm sure most people know that Nicole Hannah-Jones started the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting. Nicole's article of yesterday is How Did Trump Roll Back 60 Years of Civil Rights? Okay, so read the article, but there's just so much swirling right now to think about the I've been really haunted this week with thinking of how exactly what she said in the article is that we were just getting there, right? We're just getting here, and I'm feeling that in my own personal family. I was just getting there to be able to ask the questions, to take both my two daughters and my parents, who grew up in the South, to the Legacy Museum to spring breaks ago. We took our spring break to Montgomery, and I watched my parents look up at the names of the counties where they either grew up or still live. So my question is, what happens next? Because you could get them politically, they're not there, and that's a hard place that we're in right now with our country, is that politically they don't want to deal, they don't feel the, well, I won't say anything, but guilt is a very memory of guilt. I'm just grateful for this conversation, so thank you all. And something you said, Professor Jennings, was really helpful about the memory. But I wanted to just say one thing about standing there in the Community Remembrance Project that, Brian Stevenson and his wonderful team, they've been placing the memorials in each place, but also one in the yard there. So you can just go and read every single one. And then that there's a corresponding, monument in that place where it happened. And a couple examples, one is that they're in Rowan County, North Carolina, the monument tells you 3 different lynchings in different generations. And I was just rereading it, and one was a mob of more than 1,000, and another was a mob of more than 2,000. And the thing that stuck in my head that day, and that just, the way that they wrote the monuments, it's consistent. No one was held accountable. I just kept seeing it, and they made that choice to say it, and it's important that they said it. So I just wanted to share that because we're grappling with being in that moment where we were right at that place where we absolutely need to be, and then we're having a rollback. So thank you all so much.
respond to the getting there, right? I haven't read the article, so I won't plead ignorance in the fifth or whatever if you ask me a question about it. But, and I'm only going on what you said we were getting there. And I think this American history, right, that like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that like, I know they're trying to get rid of critical race theory and all the things, but critical race theory tells you that this work is endless. And Martin Luther King was talking about that hilltop, but, Obama said the art bends, but, you got to lean on it because there's always somebody pushing back, right? And so, if black people know, and a lot of white people, so David knows, that, like, the work never ends. We are not there. The promised land is not the promised land. The work has to constantly be done. And we can feel that we're getting closer, but it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a Trump. We know if you've learned from anything from Obama to Trump, to Biden to Trump, right? The work is relentless. So there's no there. That's what I want to say.
History's never over, in case you didn't look. And I love President Obama, but I always felt like, nope. You're wrong, Mr. President. It does not always bend toward justice, and he knows that. But he had to say it, I guess. Thank God, by the way, the Legacy Museum is not part of the National Park System. Oh, back there, Michael Butler, who is giving a talk next week, Wednesday next week. He's a fellow here from Flagler College. I'm just saying this because his project is all about memory in the South, particularly in St. Augustine, Florida. But Michael, the next question.
My question actually relates to that, and the image that sparked the question from the film was when Jan saw the pictures. That's when it became real. And I'm familiar with that look, teaching Jim Crow, Reconstruction, Civil Rights Movement. And that begs the question then, how much did Jan know about lynching before she became aware of her family's story? And what did she do to educate herself and learn more about this characteristic that defined America at that time after the fact?
I don't actually know. I don't think lynching was particularly on her radar before this came up in her life. I do know that she has been doing a lot of reading ever since. I mean, she's always telling me a book she's read, about race, about lynching, about history. She's really, she's had her eyes opened and she's stayed in the subject matter. But what's interesting about the pictures is there was a part I'm sure you all know about the proverbial cutting room floor. There's always more you have to leave out than you can keep in a film, especially a film like this where I really made a decision to keep it as circumscribed and tight and short as it is. But there's a whole thing, that photograph, one of those photographs, the one you see the most, the other one is just so gruesome. I didn't even want to put it in, but I felt, and I really grappled with, what do I do with these photographs? How do I show them, but I don't want to show them, but how do you, what's the balance and what, and so there was a whole storyline where the photograph you see the most, of the two photographs, was in the original exhibit of the Family of Man at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1960-something. And it caused such a commotion, with the audience going through the thing, that they had to take it out. Jan is a writing teacher, and for years, she cut stuff out of magazines and used them as prompts for writing. That photograph was one of the prompts that she had used. So she had seen that photograph, but she didn't know. And actually, when she talks about it, she did said, "I didn't know it was our lynching." Like when she said that, I was like, "Did you just hear what you just said?" But it was like she's taken such ownership of her family having done that. But in using the photographs, I knew I had to, because like the whole point that she's making is about looking away. You can't look away, but how much do you look? And so I was skirting around that photo. I knew I could introduce them contextually in when she's talking about the newspaper reports. It was published with a photograph, and so then I just showed it as small as I could in the clipping from Time magazine, or Life magazine. But then when she's talking about my father saw that man and had something to do with it, and that's when you really see it. So originally I had like cut just close on a couple parts of his body, thinking that would be less painful, and then I realized it kind of poeticized it, which was not the right approach. So I put it in, and I kept it really short. And one of the last people I showed it to, you show it to people to get rough cuts, to get, feedback from people, was a man who's very, very important in my life, who's a documentary filmmaker named Jamal Joseph, who he was the former Black Panther. He spent 5 years in federal prison for a Panther action. And he's very, very much an activist. And he's also a documentary filmmaker, and he's a wonderful man. And I showed it to him, expecting, like I was bracing myself for where have I gone wrong here. And I was very relieved that the only notes he gave me were filmmaker notes. But the most important filmmaker note, which was actually also a note that came from a Black man filmmaker. I mean, it was not separated from his identity as who he was as a Black man and activist, and with his history, was you have to stay longer on that photograph. And I was like, no, don't make me do that. He said, no. And I said, I thought I was like too long on it. And he said, no, people have to see that. Let people keep it on until it gets too uncomfortable, and you get so I did. I got back in the room, in the editing room, and I lengthened the shot, and I was like, okay, that's all I can take. But it was so interesting to me that it was such a struggle of how to use the photograph and how to find that balance.
We're going to take 2 more questions, well, maybe 3, okay. Since we're on the photographs, if you don't own it or have it, that exhibition of the James Allen collection produced a book which is extraordinary. It's called, it is indeed. It's called Without Sanctuary. It has a lead essay by the late, great Leon Litwack, an historian, but it's several dozen of these photographs with lots of analysis. It was the first of its kind, a published book of lynching photographs. Anyway, that's an interesting, sensitive story about how this even got published. But let's go here for our next question. I've seen your hand up for quite some time. Then in the back row, I've got yes, and then I see a third one. We have a reception waiting upstairs too, so we're between people and some goodies.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh. Well, a couple of years ago, I had the good fortune of doing a civil rights tour in the South with our congregation. And we stopped in Montgomery and went to Brian Stevenson's, what I call the Lynching Museum. And I have to tell you, people here, that if you have not gone there, I strongly urge you to do that, because when you go there, you're seeing a lynching. You go in there, and you have these monuments that are bigger than you are, about the size of human, bigger, with names, dates, and counties. And you start out there at your level, but as you go through the museum, you drop down or they drop up, and eventually they're hanging above you. They are like, they're lynched. And it's one of the most powerful things that I've ever experienced. And I would strongly urge you, if you want to actually see that. It's amazing. But my question was, in terms of the story that you were talking about, Willie, whether at the end of the movie, when she names her father, that she is putting herself in the story, this story of lynching and American slavery, and putting herself in there, which might be her first step of some form of redemption or reconciliation. And while she may not have her father there to go through that process with him, maybe other people would be fortunate to have their parents or grandparents still alive, some memory that can be, talked about.
Absolutely. I think the great thing she says at the very end, she puts it as a question for those of you who wanted to know who was involved and there were no names. I offer you a name. And the question is, who is she offering that name to? She's offering that name to me. She's offering that name to so many folk who want to know the name. And so, yeah, you're right. She's placed herself inside the story. And I think we can, as David mentioned, we can hold off the obsession for redemption. But what we can do is put redemption as a work that we're striving toward. That is a shared possibility if we can start naming names. And that, for me, that's one of the most beautiful parts of the film, is that when she writes Frazier, you could almost put another line and say, put your name here now.
And I think that's powerful, and I think it links back to your visit to the museum, right? The lynching memorial, because there's the naming that happens there with the lynching victims when they can find them. But there's also, I don't know how, I've been 3 times, and I don't know if any of so there's the memorial where you walk in and they kind of slowly rise up, but then when you come out, they're the ones that are laying flat, right? Which are part of a project of reclaiming that those communities have to do this work and own this history. And once they do this work and own this history, they take the replica of the ones that are hanging back to their communities and create a memorial site for those, right? I ain't never seen none of them gone. I think maybe they are now. The last time I was there about 3 years ago, I took a Yale alumni group on a civil rights tour. And they were all laying there. But because people have to, he won't let you take it until you've done the reconciliation work in your communities and come up with a community plan where you're going to put it and show that you've done this work. So I think there is a parallel between the work of Jane Frazier and naming the name, but also what she's calling people to do and have to act is very similar.
And that museum names places, counties, and says it's your lynching. Yes, ma'am, in the back row.
First, this is such a useful conversation. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Connie, for letting so many of us know about this. I struggle with this a lot as a student of Chinese American history. The lynching, 1871, not in a small town that we probably haven't heard of, but in Los Angeles, 18. And I don't ever want to use the Chinese American experience to dilute any of the 450 years of oppression and racism of Blacks and African Americans in this country. but I have trouble bringing it up in conversations where it does seem a little bit more black and white, to say what is the value of what has happened to other groups of people in the same space. And I still struggle with it, even though I've been in this space for so long, that I don't want to challenge what has happened, and yet I find it could be useful. So I would love to hear your thoughts around how do we integrate it to broaden it out to all of that systemic, we talk about that systemic issues, but how do we broaden it out so we might be even more effective in understanding that this is not just this group or just these people, but beyond, and it is in our backyard every day.
I mean, American history is a violent history. It's a history that's built on racial hierarchy, right? And who's at the bottom can shift, but foundationally, indigenous people and black people in this country have sort of been the testing ground, right? So I often say, if you can do it to black people, guess what? They're gonna come for you, Chinese people. Guess what? Italians, 11 who were lynched, they're gonna come for you, right? I think we know it's like, if they come for me in the daylight, they're gonna come for you in the dark. I don't know that expression. Yeah. So we are all in the same boat, but there is a much longer history of racial division, right? So that discomfort that you feel is like, if I say something about Chinese, is it gonna sort of add to that division? I think no. But there is context and there are histories, right? So what happened to Leo Frank in Georgia is not the same thing that happened in Mississippi, but there is a narrative thread there, right? About protection of white womanhood, right? So some of the black people who are lynched around labor issues and economics, there's a link to what happens to Chinese people on the West Coast that is very different, but so there are these links that we can draw, right? But I think it is important to pay attention to those nuances, right? And so that they don't function as erasures or competition, right? That they actually allow us, and I think the point you're trying to make is allow us to see the complexity of these things, right? And that they work in tandem sometimes, and sometimes they work as erasure, and sometimes they work as justification, right? So thank you for bringing that up.
We're going to take one more question. Right back here. Do you have the mic? Go ahead.
Yes. I just want to say thank you for both the film and the panel. As someone who is black, but I'm not American, I grew up in the UK, so there's our own history of racial violence. But it's interesting to now be in a room as someone who learned the history, but to see it unfold and to see people reconcile with it as someone who's an outsider is very interesting. But something that's very unsettling for me is and it was just touched upon, the protection of white womanhood. And I feel like something we're seeing in the current times, and I'll speak more from a UK perspective, is this: we're protecting our women and children. And we're protecting our women and children, and by doing this, we're going to go after migrants. We're going to attack asylum seekers' hotels. And I don't see enough white women saying, they're not attacking me. I'm not a victim of sexual violence. And while I understand the context in the past and how we spoke about these dynamics of power, I'd like to think power dynamics have changed since then. So I would like to just open up this question based on the documentary we've watched and based on what we're seeing now. Why do we still see this lie being pushed? And why do we see a lot of women not standing up and saying this lie is false?
Well, I think we still live in a very patriarchal, sexist, racist society, and those things are linked, right? And that for a very long time, and still today, where a lot of women are economically dependent, right? And that if we take family seriously as a kind of political and economic category in which patriarchy really functions, that white women benefit from their relationships to their fathers, their husbands, their sons, right? So what does it mean to break from a father who has been dead since you were 18? You don't have to really break. You can hold those memories. But what does it mean to live in a household and be dependent on a father or a husband, in which your own status and privilege are connected, right? So it's very hard for women who are married to men who engage in these kind of politics to separate from that, right? It goes back to what Lillian Smith argues in Killers of the Dream, right? That what it means to step out of, what did you call it, this what did you call it? I'm going to give you the mic. Like what they're born, like you have to, your formation, that was the word, yeah. Black women have to break out of formation in some ways, right? And that is not an easy thing to do. And yet some are able to do it. And it does not always come without cost. This work requires giving up something, right? Maybe it's your history, maybe it's a part of yourself, part of the ideas you believe, maybe it's your brother. I don't know what her relationship is with her brother after this film, right?
Just to set the record straight, her brother is totally with her in this. It was her uncle who said justice. Now he's dead. Okay.
I got the impression about the brother. By the way, ma'am, I would strongly recommend, that's what we do, we always recommend something to read, but read the last great speech of Frederick Douglass's life. It's called Lessons of the Hour. It is all about lynching. He boils it down to what he calls 3 excuses that have existed in America for violence against black people. The third of those excuses is the rape mythology. But at the very end of that speech, he makes this forceful argument that what you have to do is take the power out of a lie. Power has to be taken. And of course, that's not simple, is it? Big lies last because they're big. They're big, they're deeply rooted. They answer something for somebody. And sometimes we're mystified by big lies because they're so wrong. But take the power out of a lie. All right, I want to leave you with this, if you don't mind. You know, it got such that almost every African-American novelist, poet, and some white novelists and poets could not end a book or a poem without referring to lynching. Sometimes the whole poem was about lynching. Well, the whole book was about lynching. We're at the very end of James Weldon Johnson's novel, 1912, called The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. It ends as he travels south to a southern town. He's passing for white. Johnson couldn't pass, but his character is. So he watches this, and he arrives in a town as the lynching is about to occur, and he watches it. And then he says this, or this is Johnson describing or narrating his character's thoughts. Have you ever witnessed the transformation of human beings into savage beasts? Nothing can be more terrible. A railroad tie was sunk into the ground, the rope was removed, and a chain brought and securely coiled around the victim and the stake. It gets worse from there, but then he ends with this. He, the victim, squirmed. He writhed. He strained at his chains, then gave out cries and groans that I shall always hear. The cries and groans were choked off by the fire and the smoke, but his eyes, bulging from their sockets, rolled from side to side, appealing in vain for help. Some of the crowd yelled and cheered. Others seemed appalled at what they had done. And there were those who turned away, sickened at the sight. I was fixed to the spot where I stood, powerless to take my eyes from what I did not want to see. I've always read that passage as him trying to capture how Americans have always not wanted to see lynchings. This film and a lot of history in recent decades have made us see this, or some of us see it. I'd like to see a poll done. Nobody's done that poll. And how many Americans actually know anything about this? But your film, Susanna, has taken another great step in informing us. So again, thank you. Sure.
Say one thing, because this gentleman wanted to film it for your class.
Oh.
If you can find me afterwards, I'll give you some more specific information, but there's a website everyone can go to, myfathersname.com. It's the title of the film, myfathersname.com, no apostrophe. If you scroll down, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But also, if you scroll down and put your name and email address in the sign up, you will not be inundated at all by newsletters because I'm the one who has to organize them. But when it becomes available next for educational distribution for educational institutions to license it, that's the next step, and then it will become available for streaming. And I will be sending out information when those things happen. So please do, if you're interested in sharing this with people or whatever, go to myfathersname.com and I'll talk to you about your specific class.
Thank you all for coming.